Hello, children's literature. And we're going to be going over learning about children and literature today in chapter 2 from our textbook. I want to begin chapter 2 with a poem by David L. Harrison that appears on the very first page of your chapter. And it is called My Book, and it is written by an older man, but absolutely sounds as if it were coming from a child. He's very much keyed into the way a young child might act whenever they were really excited about reading their first book. And it goes, my book, I did it, come and look at what I've done. I read a book. When someone wrote it long ago for me to read, how did he know that this was the book I'd take from the shelf and lie on the floor and read by myself? I really read it, just like that, word by word from first to last. I'm sleeping with this book in bed. This is the first book I've ever read. And David L. Harrison is a wonderful poet and children's author. And whenever you are looking through this PowerPoint, if you would, I'd like for you to click on this first link because it is a link to David L. Harrison actually reading one of his own poems from a book called Cowboys. And I'm going to be sharing that with the class. And it is one of my very favorite books because I love the illustrations. And the poem that he shares is called Cookie. And if you would, or if you get a chance, go to his website that I have loaded in here because he's really well worth taking a look at and even looking at some of his other books that he has available. In this particular chapter, we're going to be talking a lot about sharing books with children. And one of the things that I like the best is the very first paragraph on page 12. And in the very first paragraph on page 12, it says, you can engage children as readers by placing books in their hands that interest them and are appropriate for their reading abilities, as well as challenge them as inquirers. Finding the right book at the right time is always a combination of knowing the child and knowing the books, and that's what I'm really going to press for in this particular chapter. This intersection of books and readers depends on building your knowledge of children and developing your strategies for selecting books. And one of the things that I want to point out is that if kids haven't found a book that, if they haven't really become readers yet, it's simply because they haven't got the right books put in their hands at some time. You know, there's a quote that I think it's from J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter fame that goes something like, if you don't like to read, you haven't found the right book. You've probably seen that somewhere before. Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here. This chapter goes into talking about that the most important task that you face in connecting children with books is not only having a good knowledge of children's literature and what's out there, being familiar with a lot of different genres and being familiar with a lot of the classics and a lot of the new things, but also knowing what is appropriate to the children that you are working with. And on pages 12 through 13, it talks a lot in your textbook about age level characteristics. It talks a lot about, you know, some of the books that they might like. And I would also like for you to, or I'd like if you would please, under class handouts on our blackboard, I have a handout there called Ages and Stages that I would like for you to take a look at, because it does list a lot of books that are most often considered appropriate to different children's levels. But there are also several interest inventories there that are appropriate for different ages. And with the interest inventories, in your chapter 2, it begins talking about that from pages 13 all the way over to 15, and then it kind of gets into evaluating books. On the interest inventories, whenever you are going into a classroom, one of the first things you have to do is get to know the kids in your class. Know your children. Know your audience. And at the very beginning, first few days of school, those interest inventories can always come in really, really handy. For those of you who are going on into the education program, you'll be taking certification exams in order to be certified to be a teacher. And the very last certification exam that you take is during student teaching, and it's called the PPAT. I think it stands for Performance Praxis Assessment for Teachers. And in that, one of the very first things that you do, one of the very first tasks that you have to do with the class that you are student teaching in, is to give them an interest inventory to show that you are trying to get to know those kids better. And I would hope that you would take a look at those in the handouts on our Blackboard. It'll give you a much better idea of what we're talking about here. There is also a short article there called Evaluating Children's Literature, and I would hope that you would please take a look at that as well, because it goes right along with pages 13 and 14 of your textbook for this particular chapter on considering the research on children's interest levels, discovering their reading interests, and then over on page 15, evaluating text complexity. So if you would, please, please, please take a look at that. On getting to know the child, there's a lot of information in the text about learning or being familiar with the complexity of the written material. There's a lot in there about the influence of gender on reading material, although that's not entirely clear. However, we keep finding over and over again that with both boys and girls, they love adventure, they love comedy, they love horror, they love ghost stories. Kids love series of books because they get familiar with the characters and they like to continue carrying that on. If you'll notice here, I've got in here that least popular with boys is poetry and romance, least popular with girls is sports related and war or spy titles. A lot of people will tell you that the reasoning behind some of those findings simply comes from very often our stereotyping with children from birth. A lot of that just cannot be completely done away with, whether we like it or not. But get to know the child. Again, get to know the child. Did I say get to know the child? Yeah, I did. Whenever you are talking to children about books, look at how they respond to the covers of books. Have you ever looked at a book before and just by looking at the cover you went, I don't really think this book is for me? Talk to the kids about the covers of books. See what it is about them they might not like or what they do like. Get to know illustrations. Get to know a little bit about illustrations in children's books and get to know whether or not those appeal to certain kids in your classes. Make sure that in your classrooms that you are sharing a lot of diversity in your children's literature. make sure you have a healthy dose of multicultural children's literature in your classroom libraries, because you want your children, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what type of background that they come from, that they actually see themselves in some of the children's books that you're including in your classroom and that you're sharing with them. Be enthusiastic about your own favorites. Very often I found that the books that I shared with students that I tended to laugh the most from, believe it or not, were the ones that they laughed the most from. If I was most enthusiastic about it, they were most enthusiastic about it. The best way to get a reluctant reader to read a book is by your recommendations, by your enthusiasm, and of course by even their peer influence. Again, I mentioned on pages 15 to 16 in your textbook, it discusses evaluating children's literature. There's also that handout on our blackboard that I would like for you to come back to when you're going through and studying this chapter. Please take a few minutes to look at that. When we're talking about evaluating children's books, we're talking about usually three main things. One is the readability level, the vocabulary and the sentence structure. Is it the type that children are comfortable with? Even as adults, there are books that you might pick up and you start to read it, and either the vocabulary in it is not good, or the sentence structure is not good, or not a good fit for you. I know that when I read books, for example, I love, whether you've ever been against them or not, I love the Harry Potter books simply for the fact that they are some of the most well-written books that I've ever seen. The vocabulary is challenging. The sentence structure is great. It's interesting. But even as an adult, like I said, there are books I can't hardly stand. Do you remember a long time ago, or not a long time ago, but several years ago, it's in your lifetimes, that those naughty books about 50 Shades of Grey came out, and everybody, every middle-aged woman my age anyway, they were reading those books, and they were saying, oh, you've got to read these books, you've got to read these books. Well, I saw some of them at Sam's one day, and I picked them up and I started looking at them, and the only thing I could think of while I was looking through them is, why didn't somebody edit these better? The vocabulary in them was rarely above about a third grade vocabulary. The sentence structure was so poorly written, and very often fragmented sentences, that all I wanted to do was like take a red marker and edit those stinking books. So I thought, regardless of whether they'd be a thrilling book to read or not, I didn't want to read them, because I really just did not like the readability of them. Very often with children, it's not even that. Very often with children, it's the concept difficulty. There's a lot of fantastic books out there that we're going to talk about in class that are actually, like, for example, might be a picture book, but it's for older children because the theme of it or the topic of it is too complex for little ones to understand. Take, for example, some of the ones I'm going to be sharing with you about the Holocaust. That might be something that a kindergartner or a first grader is just not ready to handle yet, although it's a beautiful picture book. So you have to take in mind the conceptual difficulty of a book. The text complexity, there's a really good page or a really good table on page 16 for you to go back and look at that'll give you a little bit more idea of what to look at when it comes to text complexity in children's books. Also, as I kind of alluded to before, very often the size of a book, the shape of it, the illustrations, sometimes even the paper quality or the binding is a turnoff to kids. There's just something about the starkness of the printing on the page that kids just don't want to be around. And so you have to think about all of these different things when you're going through and you're trying to evaluate a child's book. When we're talking about discovering the reading interests of children, there are 10 main questions that you can ask on page 14 of your text that I would like for you to go back and look at whenever you get a chance. And they are things like who lives in the house with them. That's just good getting to know your students. What are their favorite things to do? What kind of stories do they like to hear? What do they like to spend their free time doing? Tell me about a book that you've enjoyed before. I ask you all to tell me about a particular reading memory or book in the first week to share with the class. And it makes a difference. You get to know someone by seeing something that they were particularly interested in or that meant something particularly significant to them. This chapter also has ways that you can develop to help choose books. It talks about different journals on pages 18, 19, and then it starts talking about awards. When you are looking through the PowerPoints for this particular course on our Blackboard, you will notice that one of the PowerPoints there is nothing but book awards. That was even mentioned last week in our discussions. And be very familiar with the books that win the Children's Book Awards, because that's a tried and true place to come back to always be good for your kids. Two things. There are some articles on our Blackboard under class handouts that I mentioned before that I would like for you to go back and look at, if you would. One is on evaluating children's literature, and there's one called What Makes a Book Good, and there's those interest inventories. What I'm asking you to do this week, while you are doing your remote learning anyway, is this. Please share with the class 3 things that you found to be of most interest to you in those articles. Then I want you to make sure and look at that PowerPoint loaded into Blackboard on awards, like I mentioned last week. I'm going to be sharing a book called Balderdash about John Newbery of the Newbery Children's Book Awards with the class whenever we are face-to-face. But if you would, I'm going to ask you to be coming into the class whenever you come in, and share with the class 3 things that you found to be of most interest to you. All right? In all of this. So if you have all of that ready when you come to class, all the better. If you come on Mondays, then and you're already looking at this, that's great. You can go ahead and be ready to share on Monday. If not, we'll be talking about this on a little bit on Monday, and I'm going to be having you guys look through that while we're actually in class and share with us. If you come to class on Wednesday, I want you to come to class prepared to share it, because we're going to be sharing a bunch of books as well. I hope you enjoy looking through all of this, and I look forward to seeing you in class.